I have here a LUMIX S1 Mark II, all rigged out, ready for douchebag filmmaking. So for those of you who have unfortunately subscribed to me over the years, know that I am a Sony fanboy douchebag trash. And some of you would even call me a LUMIX hater, which would probably trigger those of you who think I'm a LUMIX hater, because LUMIX sent me this S1 II as a long-term loaner camera. I'm not really sure exactly how long I'll be keeping it, but I had it for almost a week now, and I've been literally using it on client shoots, testing it on my own time every day that I've had it. And if some of you think that I'm going to be saying a bunch of positive things about the LUMIX S1 II because somehow LUMIX sponsored this video, they did not. All they did was loan me this LUMIX S1 II and the new LUMIX 24-60 f2.8 zoom lens. So this video is going to be about the LUMIX S1 II from a Sony douchebag fanboy perspective. I've been filming with Sony cameras for more than a decade now, and it has been my primary brand of camera ever since. When I bought my first camera back in 2014, the Sony NEX6, I was actually comparing it with a Panasonic GH4, and I also compared it later on with the GH5. The one thing that was always an issue for me with Panasonic has been autofocus. LUMIX had always been that brand that really catered to video making. So like they had all the specs. They had like 10-bit 4K 60 way before any other camera brand on Micro Four Thirds. And those are all very desirable specs. But for people like me who started off doing wedding films, running gun, having the ability to get really high quality footage only if you land focus was a sacrifice I was willing to make if I got only 8-bit, 1080, 60 frames, but at least that footage is in focus all the time. And also the fact that I'm also one of those dudes who just really love bokeh, depth of field and all that. So of course I'd rather gravitate towards full frame and like APS-C size sensors instead of Micro Four Thirds, where I'll be struggling to get focus half the damn time. So of course I went the Sony route, and as I started doing wedding filmmaking, as I started getting more into wedding filmmaking, I started hiring second shooters, and both of my second shooters at the time the name was Kin and RJ, and you see RJ in some of my other like BTS videos. They were actually both Panasonic D-bags. They had GH5s and all that stuff. And guess who converted them to shooting with Sony? Me. Because when we went on these wedding shoots, I would give them like my Sony A7 III, and clearly they saw how the autofocus works. And this is even before like touch tracing and all that stuff. And RJ ended up buying A7 III, and he now owns A7S III and an FX-3, and Kin, I believe. He doesn't work with me anymore, but he owns ZV-E1. So fast forward to today, LUMIX now offers full frame and reliable phase detection autofocus. Like one of the things that really intrigued me about the LUMIX S1 II and finally made me really interested in trying it out was the fact that it has 4K 60 using full frame of the sensor. Although it seemed like I was a LUMIX hater, I have always said that I was impressed with the LUMIX S5 Mark II and the S5 Mark IIX came out. The only thing I was really complaining about was a lot of douchebags out there online, whether the YouTube comments or whatever was saying that I shouldn't have bought my Sony ZV-E1, which I'm filming with right now, and I should have gotten like S5 Mark II, S5 Mark IIX because it's better and all that stuff. So a lot of my vitriol, a lot of my hater videos was geared towards answering to those douchebags. But I always respected what this LUMIX S5 Mark II and Mark IIX could do. The only daggers for me was 4K 60 was cropped, and of course, rolling shutter, which is basically the same rolling shutter as A7 IV, which I own. And for the most part, when you're sitting here doing these videos, it's okay. But when you start moving around, especially if you have like a 50mm or above focal length, that rolling shutter really shows itself. And to me, that's a deal breaker for someone who has aspirations of filming sports, potentially NFL, whatever, as a freelancer or something like that. Who knows? Hopefully one day, God willingly, I'll be able to do that. And I don't want to be using a telephoto 70 to 200 chasing after some football players, and I got all of this wavy nonsense. I'm not down with that. So obviously the LUMIX S1 Mark II has really good rolling shutter performance, under 15 milliseconds, I believe, in standard dynamic range mode, which is 100% usable. And in my tests, the S1 Mark II in standard mode is very comparable to me using an FX3 when it comes to like highlight recovery and all that. So I have absolutely, and that's basically what I'm looking for, was if I was going to use another camera that's not my FX3, it has to have at least the same dynamic range performance. And it does. In real world use, it does. I don't know about like Zyla 2. I don't know about that Zyla 21. So that's up to jail, undone to doing all that stuff. But for real world use, when I'm trying to recover highlights and everything, it's basically the same. You know, I'm not gonna be able to tell the difference between like a third of a stop of light or something like that. So the other question is autofocus, and can the autofocus of the LUMIX S1 II keep up with how I do things? And in terms of tracking people, which is what I film the most, I find that it tracks humans pretty much the same way my FX3 does, and even my ZV-E1 does, as I had tested it with here video clips of my daughter running back and forth with her foolishness working for me on my YouTube channel with no pay, like most Asian parents do with their child labor. The only difference between her and other Asian kids back in the day was other kids be working the register and taking orders on the phone at their parents' local Chinese food restaurant, where she's just here chilling and occasionally being in my footage. And of course, my son here. So with that being said, I find the autofocus completely usable. Now, I got this camera last Saturday. The LUMIX S1 II was delivered to me last Saturday at 11 a.m. sharp via FedEx. And I had a shoot at 5 a.m. in the morning in DC. I was using my Sony cameras for that shoot. And I actually had another client shoot at 1 p.m. that same day. Fortunately, that shoot in DC ended early, and I drove an hour home. I picked up the LUMIX S1 Mark II, and here I have the Sigma 2845 f1.8 zoom lens for Al mount. And I took that with me to the client shoot at 1 p.m., which was basically a lifestyle shoot for a realtor. And I actually just started using the LUMIX S1 Mark II right away. And for your information, I've never touched LUMIX S camera before. The only time I ever used LUMIX camera was for about 5 minutes, which is a GH5. And I still didn't know the menus, which are diabolical. If for any of you Sony fanboys that ever tried to use LUMIX S cameras, these menus are ridiculous in my opinion. People say Sony menus are trash. This is dumpster trash, 100%. A lot of things doesn't make sense. I'll probably talk about it a little bit more, but I risked it. I did the whole shoot, you know, messing around, fiddling around, not with the best settings in Vlog. You know, I couldn't even find how to set up autofocus tracking or anything like that in the menu. So I was just basically just doing spot focus. And for the most part, it worked perfectly fine. And I was able to get the shoot done and nothing was ruined, nothing was messed up. Once you have done filmmaking for a long time, you know what you need to get, you know how to get it. And hey, as long as you know how to hit the record button and expose and compose, worst comes to worst, I'll just maintain your focus. But overall, it worked out. I had been fiddling with the menus, trying to set up my custom stuff the whole week. And, you know, one of the reasons why it took me this long to even do this video was because I am trying to be thorough. I'm trying to test everything before I go up on YouTube talking a bunch of shit. I had to make sure everything is legit. Like, I had to make sure that I tested thoroughly enough to give a good opinion on it, because it was up to even yesterday, I was still messing around with autofocus settings, because one thing as a Sony user, you would know that if you picked your autofocus like tracking settings, if you do lock on, that means the camera would lock on to whatever you touch on your screen, and you know that it will lock on and it won't like just jump all over the place for the most part. LUMIX is a little bit different. For some reason, when I use lock on, it doesn't lock on like that. I think it just try to lock on into like a certain spot on, like it tries more to lock on to a certain focus point on the screen. It doesn't make sure you lock on to the tracking. So I had that thing set on as lock on, thinking it's the same thing as Sony, but it doesn't operate like that. So for me to get the best autofocus to match like how I have it on my Sony, I just put like transition all the way to on fastest and like overall speed all the way as fast as I can. And it seems to be very responsive that way. So if you have any intentions of switching from Sony to LUMIX, you know right now that LUMIX autofocus will surely get the job done for you. I mean, obviously, if this wasn't the case, I wouldn't even think about trying the LUMIX S1 II. It's the fact that it has every codec setting that LUMIX could possibly throw into the camera for you. Like they push this camera, this processor as hard as they can, because there are some things that can do at certain frame rates and there's some things it can't do at certain frame rates. And, clearly LUMIX tried to like put every little bit into this camera for the user. So for example, in 120 frames per second, 4K, it's a little bit cropped in. It's like 1.24 or whatever in cinema 4K. And you actually lose autofocus tracking. It's still, autofocus still works. You just can't see any tracking going on. You just kind of have to hope for the best. However, if you lower it down to 96 frames per second, you get all of your autofocus tracking settings back. So for whatever reason, they couldn't do it in 120. They said, okay, we could do it in 96. So let's just put it in there for the consumer to use. And, if they want it, it was right there. And that's also because, to think about it, first 120 frames per second is slower, right? You could set it to 20%, but 96 is actually 25% speed. So that's actually a good compromise in my opinion. And it's cool that they put it there. Unlike Sony, where, for example, the A1, which is like a $6,500 camera, A1 Mark II, you could do 4K, 24, 60, 120. It has all the focus settings, everything. It works great. It has a great processor and all that stuff. But then like, they don't allow you to do like a 6K. They don't allow you to do open gate, things of the nature. And I know some of you douchebags out there is going to say, oh, you said before that open gate was overrated. There's always things people like to leave out. I said open gate was overrated for social media cropping from landscape to vertical. And for the most part, I still stand by that. Like if I'm shooting this right now in 16:9 and I cut vertical, it's fine. I don't necessarily need open gate for that. But I do know that open gate is great for just general reframing when you're filming client videos and you want to be able to scale in, animate, keyframe up and down on the frame. You have that resolution there. You have more range to crop in and out and do all these things, especially with 6K, or what LUMIX has also is 5.1K full frame, 60 frames per second open gate. For you to pretty much do whatever it is that you want with that frame, especially if you are going to render on a 16:9 aspect ratio or 235:1 or whatever it is that you want to do. But for social media, which is the realtor that I'm working on now, which the client I'm working now for the realtor, her main deliverable is actually vertical video. She wants vertical video for her content. So with if I was just shooting with Sony, I would have to flip my camera vertical, and that's all I have. And of course, there's AI options to like expand landscape if I wanted to. But the fact is, I just film an open gate. I get the vertical footage from that. And if I need video or like her website or something, if she wants me to deliver a 16:9, standard video website or YouTube or something like that, I had that option there. So that is where OpenGate is valuable. And although to me, it's not necessarily like the end all be all reason to go and switch and go buy a camera, but I do think that every camera brand, so long as the processor and all that is capable of it, should just offer that in the camera. And they do this stuff is simply is a business. Like that's the only thing that it really is. They reserve certain things for their high-end cinema cameras, and they want you to, till it upgrade to that, you're gonna have to get that cinema camera, which in my opinion is a bunch of load of bullshit. I'm all about these small form factor cameras. Okay. I have no intentions to ever upgrade to like Burano type camera or like Arri Alexa type camera. Yeah, those things have great quality and everything, but with that cost for like 1% better image quality, whatever you want to call it, it's not worth it, And I do have aspirations of filming docs or maybe even filming, some short film or something like that. And, best believe I'm not going to be trying to get a production company to fund me. I am going to film it on my own. I'm going to film it the way I want to film it. And best believe I'll be filming it in cameras like this. I am not going to go out and get like a big old Vox giant camera for no reason. If I really needed the size like I did here, I would just rig it out like this out of the monitor. I have a V mount. It's going to last all day. So, times are changing, and I really appreciate LUMIX just stuffing every freaking cinema feature into these small body cameras. And hopefully one day they'll chop off that viewfinder and do even like an FX-3 style body, just so, it's a little more compact. You don't need to use a viewfinder. For me, I actually like, this is a really nice viewfinder on this LUMIX S1 II. I still prefer to just look at the monitor. Speaking of monitor, this monitor is way better than any Sony monitor that I'd use. You probably heard me say this in fast. I'm a 41-year-old Asian piece of douchebag trash, and my vision is dong. Basically, I used to be able to see close up with my near-sighted glasses on. This allows me to see far, and I was able to see the screen just fine when it's close up. But now I can't do that anymore with these glasses on, and I've been having trouble seeing the screen on my Sony. For some reason, I have no problem seeing things on this LUMIX S1 II screen because the screen is actually quite decent. It's bigger, it's clearer. When you do manual focus, the punch-in is like very clear, whereas like the zoom-in focus for the Sony cameras, I can't even tell if it's in focus or not. Whereas the LUMIX, it's pretty clear when something's in focus, even with or without focus peaking and all that stuff. So it's just certain things like this really irks me as I go through realizing Sony's business model, Sony's, marketing schemes and all that stuff, seeing that, how they're operating as a camera company. They make good cameras. They're great cameras. Okay. Like I'm not here trying to trash my Sony ZV-E1, my FX. I love these cameras, but it's clear to me that they are holding things back to fit into like their ecosystem, how they build things out from vlogger cameras, beginner cameras to cinema cameras. It's kind of trash, and you can, say that LUMIX is, not being divisive, just like loading everything in there. I just greatly appreciate that because, other examples of this is you lose autofocus tracking when you plug the HDMI in at 60 frames per second. Anything more than 60 frames per second, which sucks. Sony doesn't have a limitation of that, at least in the FX-3. Like it doesn't matter what frame rate I'm shooting, I still have full autofocus, even with HDMI plugged in. So this is also telling me that, LUMIX is not doing this because they're just holding back is because either they haven't figured out in the firmware or there's some limitations of the processing speed. Because the other thing is a 24 megapixel sensor. There's a lot more pixels you got to go through versus like an FX3 is only 12. So there's that. With that being said, I'm going to switch out the Sony ZV-E1 for the LUMIX S1 II, and we are going to see the difference in the footage, the framing, whatever. This whole V-mount piece is just out came quick release, so that comes off right away. And this top piece with the monitor comes out like that. And just like that, it's no longer rigged. And I'm going to switch out with the LUMIX S1 Mark II, 6K open gate, and you can see how much more top and bottom. But of course, this is a more zoomed in shot. It's 28 instead of 24. And I'm going to try to, as you can see, autofocus tracking. It's fine. Earlier, when I did the test, when I tested this LUMIX S1 Mark II, it was always being compared with the FX-3. And the reason why is, yeah, the FX-3 is like 5 years old, but that's just how good the FX-3 is, right? Like, it's like my main video camera. And I want to see if the LUMIX S1 II can be as good or better than my main video camera. And I also had to make sure I tested it with similar lenses. So I'm using the 20-45 f1.8, which I actually bought with more money for L mount, just to use. And I used to own this for the Sony E mount system before I bought the 20-70 f2, which is the lens obviously the LUMIX doesn't have. So at least it kind of gives me a familiar feel, and that I could compare the autofocus performance and all that stuff with a lens that I know works a certain way, and that it should feel similar on the LUMIX S1 II in terms of like focusing and all that stuff. And when I was testing the colors and all that stuff and the autofocus, I also wanted to use familiar lenses. So when I was testing to see if the S1 II's autofocus could keep up with FX3 or ZV-E1, I was using the 7 Artisans. I was using the TT Artisans 75 f2, one for E mount, one for L mount. And this is a fantastic lens that I have reviewed in the past. They sent me the same E mount version, and I reached out to them to send me an L mount version just so I could test with the LUMIX S1 Mark II. And autofocus for like a $200 Chinese low budget lens, and the look that it gives, like it has like this character type look, I love this lens. It's a lens I highly recommend for E mount, and I also highly recommend for LUMIX as well. One of the biggest problems with LUMIX is that it lacks a lot of these lenses that the E mount system has. Such as the 24 1.8 that I was using. That was a 7 Artisans E mount lens, and LUMIX doesn't have that. Like the cheapest 24 1.8 lens that I could buy is like $900, whereas the 7 Artisans 24 millimeter is only like $320. Those things are things you have to think about if you are considering switching from Sony FX-3 from Sony to LUMIX, is the just lack of third-party lens options, especially good cheap ones. And as a videographer, I don't necessarily demand like GM lenses. If anything, I actually like this look of the Sigma 2845 1.8 more than I do the 20-70 f2 GM. GM stands for got money because it's a $3,000 lens, but the GM is just very sterile. It doesn't have like character to it. It's a really high-end zoom lens. People who desire perfect imagery, who want to get that. The Sigma has a little more character, a little more swirly bokeh, a little more, cat's eyeing and all that stuff, which I really like. And I just prefer lenses that look interesting more so than regular lenses, because you think about it this way. You go on social media, everyone kind of has like the same basic setup, right? They have like a 24-70 type thing. It all kind of just looks very standard, but if you want to stand out, you need to get like different looks. LUMIX lacks those nice the Lumix lacks like this huge lens lineup. And I'm not even talking, and I'm just not talking about just GM, whatever. I'm just talking about other lenses off there. But it should get better. I heard they're going to potentially get Viltrox and more 7 Artisans, TT Artisan lenses, Surays on board and stuff like that. So things will change as time goes on. When I was like testing the colors and seeing if I could match the LUMIX S1 II colors with FX3, and the reason is I never considered totally switching, but I was more so considered adding the S1 II to my kit, using it with my Sony cameras. And I also use the same lens. I use the Blazar Mantis anamorphic lens. It's a 1.33 times squeeze. And another benefit of using open gate is using anamorphic lenses. You get more of your image using more of your sensor, and the final render, the final output of your video is going to have better resolution, because unless you want to keep super wide angle at 16:9 with this really thin aspect ratio, you could use 16:9, because whereas with 1.33 times squeeze with open gate, you get almost a full 16:9, meaning when you crop it, you're not going to lose any resolution. On top of that, it's 6K on the LUMIX S1 II. So if you're going to try to get into anamorphic and all that stuff in any price range, I don't know, under $30,000, the LUMIX is available here for $3,200, and even cheaper than that was like, and even cheaper with that, you know, and then that with like S5 Mark II or whatever. But yeah, so when I was testing colors, I was trying to use the same lens. I used the Blazar Mantis, and so with the colors, shot in Vlog, and I shot in S-Log3. Shot in S1II, shot in Vlog, and I just used the same LUT that I have. I used the LUT that I made for my Sony S-Log cameras, and I just dropped that same LUT across all the footage. And to get the LUMIX S1 II to be close enough to the Sony FX-3 footage, meaning like if I was going to cut from different angles, like no one could really tell, basically increased the white balance, the warm white balance by like +4, and I pushed towards magenta +3.5. So strangely enough, everyone always says Sony is super green, but that's when 2 is even more green, and I actually had to add in magenta to get it to match close enough to the FX3. So it wasn't really that difficult. I didn't have to like go into like HSL or anything. It was simply just a little bit of white balance and a little bit of magenta, and then it matched good enough to my eyes where I'm completely comfortable using the S1 Mark II with the Sony FX-3 going back and forth. And we could talk about a lot of things, you know, with the LUMIX S1 Mark II, other features it has and all that. You know, there's other videos that has more specs and everything. And I'm just want to speak to things that are important to me when it comes to the camera. And most people aren't going to be able to tell the difference between if I was filming with FX3 or LUMIX S1 Mark II. And for me, I could basically do my full jog with FX3, no problem, obviously. But trying out the S1 Mark II and seeing the image firsthand, like 6K, working with OpenGate on like a client that needed vertical video as a primary thing, and then having the possibility of going to, you know, 16:9 mode, and then seeing the additional resolution that I'm able to get, seeing the additional aspect ratio and resolution I can get with anamorphic lenses, just the sheer amount of detail that I'm able to get with the LUMIX S1 Mark II that, you know, unfortunately, because I didn't really, you know, the only thing I was really using was FX3. Like I thought the FX3 had, you know, plenty of detail, but then when I compare the footage together, it's a big difference. And, you know, as a filmmaker, as a tech nerd, whatever, it became painfully obvious what the limitations are in the FX3. And then, you know, seeing Sony's lineup of what they have planned, I don't have confidence that they're going to give us anything close to what the LUMIX S1 II provides, like 6K, all those different codecs, OpenGate. Oh, and of course, you know, I'm not gonna sit here and not talk about the IBIS. The IBIS I had no problems. The IBIS on the FX3, the IBIS in the S1 Mark II is just better. So that you have, that to contend with. And as someone who is I'm someone who likes using gimbal, but I also like to just do handheld stuff, man, like on that rig. And if the IBIS is good enough where I don't even have to like pick up a gimbal, like that's even better, So, taking all that into consideration, like the next camera that Sony even has, and this is going from like mainly a videographer, right? That is close to what like an S1 Mark II is like the Sony A1 Mark II, which is $6,500. And yeah, it's 8K. This is not 8K, but like, let's be honest, 8K content is not even a thing. 6K is a great option in terms of like being able to like reframe and all that stuff for 4K delivery. Being able to do like 6K, 5K, dual K 60, open gate, 6K 60, like all the options that you have in the S1 Mark II for $3,200, and you see that Sony has the A1 Mark II, there's just no way that they were going to give us a similar camera to the S1 Mark II for cheaper than like the FX3, which is $3,900, with the audio handle. So what would that look like? If it is better than FX3, which is what most FX3, which most Sony users, Sony video shooters are gonna want, it's not gonna be cheaper than $3,800. And there's a reason why I don't own a Sony A1 or A1 Mark II. It's because it is too expensive. I don't think it is worth it for me to get that just for video. And that's why I've been using the FX3 all this time. And then now LUMIX has this cam, the S1 Mark II, $1,300. I pre-ordered before I received this camera from LUMIX to test. And my idea was that I was gonna pre-order it. It was during the build week. They had a great discount on the S1 Mark II for $2,700. And I figured, hey, if I try out this camera and then it doesn't work for me, I could just cancel my pre-order. And I'm telling you right now, I'm not canceling my pre-order. In other words, I am switching to LUMIX S1 Mark II as my main video camera. And then I'm going to use it along with my FX3 and my ZV-E1 as like B and C cameras. And I also own FX30 and an A7 IV, which I'm going to sell. I sell my FX30, A7 IV, and some AKS-C lenses I have, whatever. And I'm gonna just use S1 Mark II, FX3, and Sony ZV-E1 as my cameras. And it's gonna work because I already have the Sigma 28-45 f1.8, which I love. I'll be using that. I have the TT Artisan 75 f2 if I need to get tighter focal in. And another thing about the Sigma 28-45 f1.8 on the S1 Mark II versus when I was using on FX3 is because this thing actually has a real APS-C mode. By real APS-C mode, it does 4K because it is 24 megapixel sensor, giving me a lot more range with the Sigma 20-45. Now I can get up to like almost a 70 millimeter f2.8 background blur look, but with the 1.8 light gathering. And pretty much it's getting me pretty close to what like a 28-70 f2 GM could do at only $1,300 for this lens. I also pre-ordered the 24-60 f2.8 just because if I want to use it for traveling, I'm not going to be lugging around the Sigma 2-pound lens. I want a smaller lens. Yeah, I'm officially a LUMIX douchebag user. I don't want to necessarily say I'm a fanboy, and it seems like I guess I have to revoke my Sony fanboy douchebag card because now I'm using both LUMIX and Sony. So, yeah, Sony is tough to let go just because, why I won't do like a complete switch is because that means I'm going to have to like buy, in terms of lenses, I'm going to have to like sell all of my lenses, and then I have to buy to replace the telephoto stuff for like weddings, the angles. I'm going to have to get like a Sigma, 70-200
200 f2.8, which is like $1,500-$1,600. Whereas on the Sony, I'm using like the Tamron 7180. That lens is like $1,000, and it does the job. So like, it just doesn't make sense that way. And the only camera right now that I'm interested in from LUMIX is the S1 Mark II, because it could do all those specs, plus it does 4K, 60 frames per second, 4K, 6K, full framed. And I have nothing against APS-C. It's just that if I buy a full frame camera and I'm primarily using it in the full frame, field of view, focal length or whatever, I don't want to switch into like using 60p and then all of a sudden my focal length is completely different. I want the consistency across all, I want consistency between 24 frames and 60 frames. 120, it's something I barely use. I don't use that much of. So I'm okay with it being like cropped in or whatever a little bit, but I don't really compromise these days between 24 and 60 frames per second. And, that's actually, big reason why like I didn't use the A7 IV that much. And also a big reason why I don't really care for the Sony FX-2. This day and age, as primarily a filmmaker, and only does photography sometimes. And again, this LUMIX S1 II is going to replace like any type of photography I need to do for like the client, because obviously 12 megapixels is fine for me, to be honest with you. The client's probably going to want a little more resolution for whatever. So 24 megapixels is perfectly enough for some event photo or food photography for a restaurant or something like that. And so that's why I could get rid of the A7 IV, because I don't need that 33 megapixel, at least really. And really, I got the A7 IV as my photo camera and like as a C or D video cam. And look, this is me, this is my use case. I'm not on this, doing this video to like get people to switch over and do what I'm doing. And everyone have their own preferences in it, but once I started looking at that footage and realizing, hey, I'm getting like 95% of Sony autofocus with this camera. And speaking of autofocus, the only thing it really lacks is like being able to touch track anything that is non-human or like, non-specific anytime, while you're focusing on stuff. So like, you're doing, face detection and all that stuff, and then you want to focus on like, I don't know, a tree and track a tree. You could do that. Whereas on LUMIX, when you try to touch the screen for something else, it just does a spot focus. It doesn't do a tracking, and you can't do that unless you actually go into the settings and like completely change those settings out completely. So, I am an active autofocuser, which means when I film, I don't just sit there and just let the camera do things. I like, as I'm filming, I actively like touch the screen, touch track, different things. Like I'm constantly like moving my fingers on the screen. And so, if there's any random hiccups with the LUMIX S1 Mark II, I'm fine with it, because, as good as Sony is, it hiccups also, and a lot of guys I see talking about like touch tracking on like random object. It's great that Sony does that, but that box that you see doesn't always tell the truth. It lies sometimes, and all because the box is on that item doesn't necessarily mean the item's in focus. So there's been times when, Sony does jump around also. I mean, it's better, obviously, than like LUMIX in terms of like the touch tracking on non-humans, cars, and all that stuff. It's not like it's like foolproof. So when I'm going to be like filming products and stuff, I'm going to just spot focus it and it'll track whatever is in that particular spot completely fine. So I'm good with that too. There's also Arri LOG C, which I like. LUMIX had already loaded firmware in this camera and it looks great. But if you're looking to buy the LUMIX S1 Mark II, it's an extra $200 if you want Arri LOG C. So, is it necessary? No, but if you plan on using this camera with Arri, of course, like $200 is nothing compared to like a freaking $100,000 camera, right? So, like if you're asking me if you should switch to LUMIX S1 Mark II, like if you own just one Sony body and you're not that invested, yeah, I mean, go for it. I don't think you regret it. If you should act LUMIX S1 Mark II to your kid, and you know, you have the funds and all that stuff and it's not gonna be a problem, yeah, have at it, man. Like, I recommend it. I don't think you regret it. After you spend some days fiddling with your options and your menus and all that stuff, make sure you get all that in order, testing it out, and make sure you know what you're getting. It's a bit of a learning curve. Again, you know, I am almost a week in, and you know, there's still some things I'm figuring out. But you know, I like the colors. I mean, I just see a lot of guys saying like the Lumix has some extra juice in the colors. I don't think so. To me, both the cameras, the colors are nice. You know, they're gradable. You know, good highlight roll off. Like, I'm not looking at the Lumix colors and you know, gawking at it. You know, and looking at the Sony colors like it's trash or something like that. They just have, they both have the colors, slightly different color science with Rec 709 and all that stuff. But I'm the type of person who I don't really care too much for like Rec 709. I like to like color my videos stylistically anyway, so it doesn't really matter to me. So with regards to like the menus, like things that don't make sense on like the LUMIX S1 II on the LUMIX menu for me is the fact that like they have like certain things that I would expect to all be in one place, like autofocus settings, right? There's like a button on the back of the LUMIX camera that allows me to do like some autofocus options, but those options aren't available anywhere in the actual menu. And then like with like log and like your LUT library and you know the LUT that you want to use to monitor, they're all in different places. You know, it's like, you know, you pick your picture profile here and you have to go to another menu to look at your LUT library, and you have to go another part of the menu to look at the, you know, what LUT you're going to be displaying in your view. Or like when I was trying to do HDMI out, trying to see what I was going to be monitoring, it's like there's like 2 different places where you could change your HDMI output. And it's confusing because I'd go to one place and I'm thinking like, does this option not exist? And then it ends up being like another part of the menu. I think that's just crazy. I don't know why it's like that for LUMIX cameras. Then this is just my opinion from Sony D-bag fanboy. Like, when Sony made their new menus on the Sony A7 FX-3, it took me a lot less time to figure that out than the LUMIX menu. Because, you know, at first, it's kind of self-explanatory until you start needing to find other stuff. Another downer is like there's 2 card slots, but it's like different. It's CFast type B versus in a SD slot. I would prefer it to be, you know, both the same. Like, so I kind of appreciate Sony how it's like 2 slots that does both does SD and type A. But you know, these are minor nitpicks that you could definitely work around. When it comes to Sony douchebag fanboys, is their talk about low light. Now, I'm not about to slander low light performance from the Sony FX-3, A7S3, and all that stuff. They are good low light cameras, but all because of low light. I'm not talking about like no light. I'm not talking about low light, non-lit scenes. So I get into arguments a lot with dudes, you know, who film weddings where they're saying, oh, Sony has amazing low light and I'm going, you know, I don't even have to bring lights with me for reception. They are high grade dumbasses. Even though our reception filming, although when I film receptions, that is a low light situation, that does not mean we don't bring lights. We still need to have lighting for contrast, even if we have to go into like ISO 12800 to get proper exposure. I still bring lights just to get some contrast in the scene. So when it comes to like real world low light, and to me, that is in a situation where you need to go to your next base ISO, right? So with the LUMIX S1 Mark II, the base ISO, the second base ISO is 5,000. So I imagine myself using 5,000 and more when needed. So there's a lot of times when, because Sony FX-3, the ISO is between like 800 and 12,800 are completely unusable. So I only use 800 or 12,800 or more than that. So when I am in low light, sometimes I'm in 12,800, but it's a little bit overexposed, and I'd have to use like an ND filter just to bring it back down
to proper exposure. And, you know, I don't mind cranking shutter sometimes, but when there's like reception lights that flicker, I have to make sure the shutter is proper, so I, you know, at least minimize the flickering. Honestly, 5000 ISO as a second base is perfectly fine, and it's probably just enough for situations like that. And I find that in real world low light, the LUMIX S1 II looks better because it has more detail and the noise is very fine. And also because of the higher resolution sensor, and that also makes the noise smaller and it just looks better. Whereas the FX3 has less detail and you see a lot of the noise removal that Sony has in the camera. I actually have noise removal completely turned off right now on the S1 II, a feature which Sony only allows in cameras like an FX6. Even the cinema line FX3, you can't turn off noise completely, which is kind of BS. But because noise removal is turned off, you have a little bit of fine noise in the image, but you just get overall more detail and the noise doesn't even look bad. So in my opinion, like real world, like low light shooting situations, I think the LUMIX S1 II is actually a bit better. And obviously when you're like really low light, that's when the FX3 is better. When you need to go into like 100,000 ISO.
And I think that's it. You know, like if you have any other questions, you know, comment below and I'll try to answer them. I'm going to make additional videos, like things that I think I missed in this video. I'm going to make additional videos to cover other knickknacks about the LUMIX S1 II compared against Sony. And again, I still have my Sony stuff, so you're still gonna see me reviewing Sony lenses, you know, talking about Sony and things like that. And I'm gonna of course talk about LUMIX S1 II. Like next week, for the next couple weeks, next week or two, I'm gonna be filming weddings. So I'm gonna talk about my experience using the LUMIX S1 II, you know, as my primary and main camera at a wedding. So all of that to come. Please like and subscribe to please if you appreciate this video, it help you make a decision. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and until next time, lighten up.
Hey man, what lens is that? I'm working on a review for this 7 Artisans 24mm f1.8 lens for Sony E-mount. Oh my god, Sony, it's rat. You need to switch to LUMIX S1 II right away. Bro, I'm not about to switch to a different camera system for perceived upgrades that I'm actually not going to make use of. LUMIX have open gay. I might make use of that once a year. It have the best IBIS. Sony IBIS in the A7S III and FX3 is actually very underrated, and the newer cameras, the IBIS is vastly improved. It do 6K. This video right now playing on everyone's phones is 720p. It will have Arri LOG C, much more cinematic. S-Log 3 is also used in cinema, so it have better dynamic range. That dynamic range is quite nice, but even that is not enough for me to sell 4 of my Sony camera bodies, over 20 lenses, for the next 2 months dealing with lowballers on Marketplace, just to switch to a different camera system. And then a month later, some new camera comes out with 8K, 120 frames per second, freaking 69 stops of dynamic range, iBig, in-body image gimbalization. And then what am I gonna do? Switch again? I'm not sponsored by Storyblocks, Squarespace, Artlist. Ain't no one got money to be on gas like that. What you mean, that? Gear acquisition syndrome. You don't need to share all that, you just buy. What are you talking about? Let me show you. Use the paybook at B&S. Asian love this CAC because you don't have to pay tax. My guy, it sounds like you have a different kind of gas. Sign up for my how to switch camera master. Bro, my bad, you don't got gas, you got straight liquid coming out of your ass.